You're familiar with our distinguished panelist, and I just wanted to begin by recalling that when I first came to New York, what is it now, 35 years ago, the Village Voice had a cover story on the unexpected treasures of New York City. And first in that list was the Asha Society, and the second was the Nicholas Roerich Museum, which is about 50 blocks north and west of here, and still continues till this day. It's interesting also the connection between the two, because Roerich was famous of describing Asia. There is pitched the tent for all travelers and seekers. And he became a seeker 100 years ago next May. It was in 1923 that he set out from this country, the United States, to India. And one of his recollections, which is very apt for the forum in which we are this afternoon, was when he went to Jaipur. And he said, "The tigers roar in Jaipur. The Maharaja has forbidden anyone to shoot them. In Golta Place, the tribes of monkeys are at war. The guide arranges a battle for a most reasonable fee. Today, all battles can be arranged for a fee." And I think that last line of his really epitomizes what was to become the logic of his pact and the banner of peace. As Shanjo reminded us so eloquently last evening, when you have war or conflict, it is children and women who suffer the most. But they're not the only ones who suffer, because they are, in a sense, the first shield for the men who will then follow. And so it was with Roerich for the less animate victims of war, national treasures, monuments, cultural heritage, because he recognized that once they become the target of aggression or cruelty or weaponry, the human race itself cannot be far behind. Yesterday, the 13th of September, marked the 33rd anniversary, I beg your pardon, the 23rd anniversary of the United Nations declaring a culture of peace. It was done on the 13th of September, 1999, just at the turn of the century. And that document, in many senses, embodied what Roerich hoped and what he strove for. It had a very eloquent reference in it, describing peace as a set of values, attitudes, traditions, modes of behavior, and ways of life, all of which were subsumed in that larger culture. So today, in a surrounding and in an environment which speaks to and of culture, where does that element stand? A concept that at one stage was considered almost exclusively political. Can we make it cultural? And do we only protect culture from its depredations? Or do we use culture to enhance its prevention? That is the first question that I would like to pose to our distinguished panelists today. May I begin with you, Swaminathan, please?
Yeah. Historically, conquerors destroyed heritage. It was a sign of showing your power, your might, that you went to the palaces, the temples, the places of worship. You destroyed them to show how great and powerful you were. Equally, the whole point of conquest was to enrich yourself. So obviously you looted whatever was of value, whether it was gold, diamonds, other artifacts, and you took it away. And if you did this on a really large scale, you would be called Alexander the Great or somebody the Great. It was considered a really great thing to have this massive amount of destruction, a massive amount of looting. Then I think the attitudes changed with the European Enlightenment and the idea of universal values, that things don't belong to just a race or a kingdom or something. They belong to all humanity. In India, I think Gandhi and Tagore are very much part of that particular tradition. Roerich came into that part of that tradition. And I think it was a great insight that here was the Red Cross, the idea of a Red Cross, that yes, there are enemies, there are people fighting one another, but if somebody is in pain, somebody is injured, somebody is dying, an independent organization should be able to go in and without fear or favor as to which side you belong to, male, female, young, old, you would be looked after as best as possible because you were a human being. So it was the universalization of a value to all, regardless of your race, nationality, anything else. And Roerich wanted to extend this to heritage. He said, as you say, whether it was a painting, a monument, a temple, a house, all of these, that they belonged not just to one particular race or individual or a kingdom, but to all humanity. And I'm glad to see that in the 20th century we began to move in this direction. Roerich anticipated the United Nations, the signing of the human rights, that we need to go on all these things. And some things, however, have been going the wrong way in recent times. I mean, there was the Taliban destroying the Buddha statues. You had ISIS or other Islamic groups destroying the most ancient monuments in Timbuktu. You've had the looting of the museums in Baghdad and Afghanistan, all kinds of artifacts just taken away, just looted, as you know, just being sold for private profit. Within India, an enormous number of temples, the idols have disappeared. They've either been stolen or sold by the priest, and you will find them in New York, London, and various other parts of the world because of this general loot going. So the important thing, as I said, is to regard it as a national heritage and stop this destruction. Unfortunately, we have a situation, I mean, Roerich was Russian, but Russia is engaged in a war in which apparently a significant amount of heritage is getting destroyed there itself. But the narrow nationalisms, without having a war in India, we are having a situation where the destruction of heritage is regarded as a great thing. The Babri Masjid was destroyed by a particular crowd, and they were so happy about it. There was no question of regarding it as heritage of all Indians, but this is the property of the enemy that must be destroyed. There is a similar attitude that we see in regard to the Gyanvapi Mosque or the Eidgah, Mosque and Eidgah in Mathura. And there are perhaps 3,000 other such who are under the target of a group of people who believe that destruction of all that is the appropriate triumph of a particular cultural value of Hinduism. And this is something that I really think we need to fight against. I myself, my ancestral village is in Tanjore district, and the Brihadeshwara temple out there, it's one of the great wonders of India. I look upon it and I'm so proud that this is mine. But equally, if I go before the Church of Bom Jesus in Goa, I say this is also mine. If I go before the Taj Mahal or the Siddhi Sai Mosque in Ahmedabad, these are also mine. When I saw the Jewish synagogue in Cochin, that is also mine. It has nothing to do with religion. It belongs to all of us. We should all treasure it. So I think these are the values we need to push forward with, and we need to fight against the enormously strong forces that we now see that are out to pulverize our heritage instead of conserving it.
Thank you. That's a very powerful phrase. This is mine. This is also mine. Thank you for that. Gopalji?
There is the question of destruction, which is a word used very centrally in the Roerich Pact. There is, as an antidote to it, the use of the word preservation and protection. So when there's a choice between destruction and protection, whether of national symbols or of national cultural icons, material or intellectual or philosophical, the choice is clear. I don't want anything destroyed. I would like what is sacred to me to be preserved, what is sacred to the other person to be preserved. That is clear enough. But there's another danger which I think the Roerich Pact and those who subscribe to it, beginning with the 21 countries on the American continent, may not have foreseen. which is not destruction, but something else, which is a modification and a disfigurement and a transformation of what exists into something else without changing the physicality of the object, but changing its spirit. I think destruction is simple enough to oppose, protection simple enough to applaud. But the subtle changes that are being made to symbols are very important. The most important and most pernicious modification of a great symbol, a cultural symbol, was the swastika by Hitler. Something so sacred to India was turned into something absolutely horrible and horrific. So much so that many in India, many of my generation certainly, are afraid to use the swastika or employ it in any way that is spontaneous and natural. And so we have to look beyond the pact and its simple, clear and almost innocent directive to the most dangerous methodologies of our times. I think post-World War II, in which the distinction between the true, the authentic, and the false and the synthetic, that distinction is not lost. Today we are afraid of anything that is not authentic, that is fake. We are not only in post-truth, but we are in a generation and in times when the artificial and the distorted original has become real. Every day is a challenge between choosing what is real and what is pretending to be real. And that is very difficult. And a false step can be very dangerous.
Thank you, Gopalji, for that salutary reminder that distortion or transformation can be as lethal as destruction itself. And I dare say, Ashaji, that's something very true of the technological industry, especially today. What are your thoughts on the context of the Roerich Pact to that adventure of discovery and yet possibly destruction?
First of all, I want to thank the Delhi Art Gallery to have preserved this important work and brought it and highlighted it today at JLF to bring out this conversation again. It's a very important piece of art that they have, and I'm glad that they're highlighting it today and getting us to talk about it. I think technology has always been a dual-edged sword. So it on one hand, it's a very powerful democratizing force that has made the internet and all the information of the world available to the last person, to the last mile. Today you have every villager who has access to smartphones and has access to information that we never had even 10 years ago. So that element is very powerful. Again, as Gopal just mentioned, I think there is also the danger of using any technology. By the way, this is not just about the internet, but any technology, whether it's an automobile, whether it is fusion of two atoms, or whether it is electricity, whether it is the printing press, a lot of technologies, disruptive new civilizational technologies. When people understand the power of what it can do, there have been, multiple vectors that have always emerged and tried to claim the energy of these new technologies. So this is nothing new actually, but I think on the as far as the internet goes, because it's so easy to amplify the good and the bad, this is something that has had dangerous implications, not just in authoritarian communist societies, but also in democracies, powerful democracies like US and India, where we have seen the current battlefield is the battlefield of narratives. And we find, people from multiple sides of the aisle creating their own narrative, using, tools and understanding that we all have from the world of advertising or marketing, and leveraging those understandings to see how we can influence behavior of people who are not fully informed. And that has created powerful and damaging conditions right now. We are in an unprecedented polarized world in the United States between the red states, blue states, and so on. We have seen January 6th happening. We see things happening in India also right now, which we are not used to. And so technology has a dangerous implication, but I personally am an optimist, Ram, and I see that at the end of the day, what will happen is those who are, in positions of power will have the will and the wisdom to bring about, certain amount of regulation, so that there isn't sort of unfettered access to this kind of power of the internet or of technology in general.
Thank you, and thank you for the reference to DAG, the Delhi Art Gallery. They have a little subscript to the banner for peace saying, "Where there is culture, there is peace. Where there is peace, there is culture." And we've talked often about the Roerich Pact and the banner for peace being a precursor for the United Nations, but it's salutary to remember it took 82 years after the pact was signed in 1935 for the United Nations Security Council to finally deplore and condemn the unlawful destruction of cultural heritage and also destruction of religious sites and artifacts in the context of armed conflict. Swaminathanji, you have witnessed and written eloquently about how nations come together in what one may call an economic cause, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank. Why has it been relatively easy for them to come to terms with each other on these bread and butter issues and yet be so ambivalent about something like culture and peace?
I would not say that everybody has got together so happily on the economic side. There is economic warfare of all kinds. We have currently the West sanctioning Russia, and Russia is sanctioning the West by cutting off gas and sending the prices in Europe up 20 times and causing an energy crisis not seen since the World War II. So I wouldn't say that economics is an area which has any less warfare than of the military kind. But yes, there have been institutions getting together on economics, and there have been institutions getting together on culture. There have been huge improvements. I mean, for instance, to me, one of the marvels, I was earlier this year down in Egypt, and you go to Abu Simbel, and you see here were these 17 of these dozens of monuments which were going to completely be drowned by that Aswan Dam. And there was an international effort that all of these monuments were painstakingly cut out brick by brick, reassembled at a higher level. And it was preserved for all posterity. This was an international effort. Nasser personally didn't care. I mean, he wanted the dam, he wanted the huge amount of irrigation. And for him, the cultural part, it was regrettable, but he was willing to lose it. But the world got together and saved those, as saying this is the heritage not just of Egypt, but of the world. And that is the kind of attitude I think we need to have on a much larger scale. I would say in India right now, we are full of history. We are full of historical monuments. There are 1,000 places to dig in. The Archaeological Survey of India, unfortunately, has very limited funds. I mean, it's not a rich country, and it's not a country that gives archaeology any great advantage. And therefore, the Archaeological Survey is unable to do 1/100th of the work that it really should be doing. But to me, then the question is, why on earth don't you throw India open to the archaeologists of the whole world? If you go to Egypt, you will find there is the German expedition, Danish expedition, American expedition, British and French expeditions. The archaeologists of the world are there unearthing these. Many of the most famous things that have been unearthed were not unearthed by Egyptian archaeologists. They were done by archaeologists of the whole world. And yet we in India, we want to keep these foreigners out. The foreigner, he might run away with some Indian artifact. Oh, for heaven's sake, I mean, we have looted our own things right through history. What are you afraid? It's the foreigners who have preserved the stuff in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in so many of their... So let them in. Let them dig. Let them go all over the place. To me, the greatest thing that has happened in India recently is the entry of the Aga Khan Foundation. They have rehabilitated the Humayun's tomb marvelously. They're doing the same to Khan's tomb. What they're doing in Sundar Nursery is a marvel. And I've been to Kabul where they're restoring Babur's tomb, which was destroyed by the civil war out there. This is just one of 1,000 institutions. Why not have 1,000 such institutions all over India digging and getting everything out? So we need in India to say that, why are we not part of this universalization? Why are we not getting the willing cooperation of archaeologists of the whole world to come and help reveal in India what our real glory was?
Thank you for that. I want to pursue one of the lines of thought there with Gopalji. Gopalji, you're really, in a very literal sense, a child of the United Nations. You were born the very week the San Francisco Conference began, which drew up the Charter of the United Nations, and the organization came into being 6 months later. Going back from Mr. Aiyar's point about, in a sense, the unique responsibility of India, a responsibility which, as you know, we exercised admirably in the case of South Africa and the declaration of racism in South Africa as universally illegal. Is there a case, and I also ask you this as the first director of the Nehru Cultural Centre in London, is there a case for India to take a greater international profile, including at the United Nations, for the protection of culture and heritage?
There certainly is, but I would like to answer your question, respond to your question with a reflection. The tools of protection and preservation have not advanced. They are exactly what they were 50, 100 years ago, which is basically speaking the truth, saying it as it is. But the tools of distortion have expanded exponentially. The way in which anything that exists can be portrayed differently from how it is, the ways of that have changed. The technologies at the hands of distortion and therefore of destruction are growing menacingly fast. But the methodologies of protection are exactly where they were. And so there's almost a losing battle between preserving what is true and what is authentic and the opposite. India certainly has a role to play in this, because it is in India that texts, literary texts, monuments have survived the ages and have been held up for the world to see, most significantly by the adoption by the Republic of India of very ancient symbols of our cultural integrity in the shape of our national emblem, in the shape of the symbols that have gone into our national flag, very, very significantly. But now it's something that has gone beyond just simple protection and replication. South Africa, which you mentioned, has a very great tradition exemplified by Nelson Mandela's preservation of certain cultural resources of that country at the time of the birth of the new South Africa, when he said that the legacy of South Africa from Afrikaans is not to be squandered, is as important for us as our own African legacies. The national anthem of South Africa, which he nurtured, has the languages of both. Sri Lanka has tried to do something very similar, though not very successfully, and perhaps not so earnestly as Nelson Mandela tried. But the most important cultural resource of India, which it has to protect and which it has to foster and to offer to the world, is the legacy of India's pluralism. India's belief in all its multiple faith traditions, which Dr. Swaminathan Aiyar referred to. And that, I feel and fear, is something which we may squander by sheer default and neglect. And I am very conscious now of the multiple uses of the very word culture in today's political narrative. Culture can become today something which is very different from what it meant to my generation or the generation before us, before mine. It can mean something which is very narrow and very intolerant. And I shudder at the possibilities of modern technology, at the use and the prerogatives of that narrow vision.
I'm tempted at this point to reflect what Nicholas Roerich's definition of culture was when he said it was the universal language of love, beauty, and action. So not something inanimate or passive to be savored and enjoyed, but something to which the human being must actively contribute. I also wanted to mention, Gopalji, that 2 points you mentioned, national integrity or cultural integrity and pluralism, to some may appear contradictory because one might appear monolithic while the other, quite obviously, is pluralistic. And in that connection, Asha ji, to bring the UN back into the conversation, one of the major attempts of the United Nations right now is to create a global digital compact, which will not only give access to digital means of communication, but also harmonize it to international standards, technical as much as ethical. Do you see a challenge to that international norm with what was described earlier this afternoon as either narrow nationalism or a sense of national identity?
You know, I see the UN as a body that exists in a system of sovereign states. As long as states, nation states, understand that it's in their self-interest to tie their hands, like in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If a nation state understands and computes in its utility matrix that it's in its self-interest to do so, it will do so. But it will not do so if it is left undesigned and uncrafted. So, for example, in the nuclear non-proliferation, we had national leaders taking 2 or 3 people at those days who had taken a leadership role in saying, how do we communicate the cost-benefit equation to various nation states to tie their own hands willingly to non-proliferation. Similarly, can we have this kind of a compact on cultural traditions, on heritage, and does that factor into the matrix of the sovereign states? Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think it's not something that is of that urgent calibration in the calculus of nation states. I don't see that happening. Even today, as we see, whether it's Russia attacking Ukraine or whether it was United States in the Middle East, for the last 20, 30 years, during the Cold War and the Afghan War, we have not really been in any way as a leader, as the architect of the post-Bretton Woods structure. We have not ourselves not been diligent about saying what is it that we are doing to protect treasures in Iraq and so on. And we've had looting happening by our own teams. So right now I don't see that much hope in the UN as being able to proliferate this, to have this kind of a compact for culture and arts. But it's something that will have to have some market imperative to do that in order for certain segments to say this is what needs to be protected. Because same thing, I think it applies to human rights. You have China, for example, signing on the human rights treaties, but when it comes to its own national self-interest, it will do with the Uyghurs what it wants to do, even though it may be part of the human rights treaty. So I see art and culture falling in that bucket, unfortunately, right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I dare say there have been instances, and one has to be very grateful for them, where the market and the moral imperatives have coincided, especially as far as the UN is concerned. And that's really, as all of you have suggested, as much because of the individual willingness of nations to, perhaps subordinate is the wrong word, but to accommodate their interests in a global context and take it a step further. Thank you for this very rich conversation, which I would now like to enlarge to include our audience listening. I think if I understand it, there is a microphone here. So if you do have a point to make or a question for any of the panelists, please do come up and share that with us.
Ramu, I have actually a question for you.
Sure.
The UNESCO report, for example, which comes out every 2 years, most countries fail to even fill up the questionnaire and the survey forms that UNESCO sets out. As a UN body, what does UNESCO need to do to be able to sell itself far more effectively to nation states so that they can look at culture and arts somewhat seriously? At the drop of a hat, everybody wants to have a song and dance, but nobody really puts in that kind of investment required to actually further culture and tradition and preserve it and take it to the next stage. So what do UN bodies or other associated bodies need to do to be able to give much more seriousness to this, because it doesn't even get enough funding?
Thank you, Chandra. I'll venture an answer to that. And much of it is really derived from what Dr. Aiyar here mentioned about what I would call a certain impatience with history, while people in our own country, India, do not venerate or give regard to our own history, our own monuments, as a foreigner might. And this leads obviously to the question about how to make the preservation of heritage, which is one of UNESCO's core functions, economically attractive to a nation. And that really comes down to very budgetary issues. One of the particular ones that I can highlight is tourism, and certainly a much greater linkage between UNESCO, which is one of the oldest United Nations agencies, and the United Nations World Tourism Organization, which is amongst the youngest. Because I'd like to divert for a moment and recollect what William Dalrymple had said at the very first Jaipur Literary Festival in 2006, where he felt that much of the audience were tourists who had mistakenly found their way in. And also a quote of Nicholas Roerich, whom we've been talking about, who said, in the north of India, American tourists are called normal because their hurrying, breathless groups have a special character completely outside the understanding of the people of India. And I dare say that that might still be true today. But having said that, I think that we really have to invest governments, and this is true of all reporting mechanisms with the UN, with the fact that by reporting to an international body, they are enlarging the scope of their own domestic increase in revenue, increase in accessibility, and increase in international understanding, international appreciation. I don't know if anyone else has to contribute to this, because I'm by no means an expert on the subject despite my connection with the UN.
No, I'd say that this nominating sites to be heritage sites, holding up particular standards. Right. I mean, in the absence of those standards, you would not get the new push that we are getting.
Absolutely.
And I think it's become a very important thing that if the UN describes something as being, this is a heritage site, that draws the tourists. Because it draws tourists, in the country itself, there is a new pride in things in which people didn't even know about themselves earlier on. So I think spreading awareness is an important thing, pride in your own cultural things, and of course the tourism then brings in revenue, it helps livelihoods. People are able to not only be proud, but make a living out of the fact that heritage is now a glowing, living part of the economy. So that, I think, is a very positive thing. And the question is, can this be extended not just to culture, but to lakes, to mountains, to various other things? There are various other things that are also in need of preservation.
No, I'm all for lakes and mountains. I also would like to caution that sometimes when you get into heritage, this whole idea of intangible heritage has become a little far too far-reaching. Spain declared got the UN to declare a year of sustainable gastronomy, which is all for the good, except when the meeting was held and the board outside, someone dropped the G, so it said sustainable astronomy. And I had a delegate from India who saw it and said, we must talk about this, and went in and spoke passionately for 10 minutes about astronomy being sustainable. And no one noticed the difference. Sorry, you were about to say something, Asha?
No, excellent point. No, I was just thinking to Sanjoy's question about, what are the ways in which UNESCO could have more teeth, so to speak. And I think, once again, I want to highlight the point that there is it's important to have some market mechanism that one can talk about and even quantify, just like we have done in the case of carbon now. In a very, very significant, very important way, we are able to now quantify what it means to do a carbon swap for certain industries, what is carbon neutral building, what is a carbon neutral industry. Similarly, is there something that one can figure out? I'm sure people have at the UN, but is there some kind of that, that equation or some variable that one can come up with which quantifies what it means for arts and culture to be a public good? And how do you monetize it? And, to Aiyar's point about, but this being part of GDP or livelihoods, is that if that narrative is crafted carefully, I think we have some hope there.
Any thoughts, Gopalji? Sorry.
I would like very briefly to refer to Roerich's greatest visual impact on my generation, which was through his paintings and those of his son of the Himalaya. The Himalaya have never been made more real to me by anything other than by the Roerich paintings. Now, are the Himalayas part of our cultural heritage which can be preserved? I would say, if Roerich's paintings are an indication, they are. But how are they to be preserved, and what are we doing to preserve the Himalaya? And whatever emerges from the Himalaya in terms of intangible culture from the Himalayas, and also the physical and environmental aspects of the Himalaya. I think the Himalaya are in danger not only in India but across wherever the Himalaya are. And I'm not going to venture into the area of climate change, but except to say that very authentic voices from the Himalaya are greatly exercised over the future of the Himalaya and over the future of the culture of the people who live in the Himalaya. And they find no solace and no reassurance from the rest of the country. And I think the Roerichs, father and son and daughter-in-law, Devika Rani, would have been greatly distressed by what is happening to them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Is there anyone else there? Or? Yes, sir. Sorry.
Yes, I'm Hugo Weyer. I would like to pick up, thank you all for a fantastic discussion. I would like to pick up on Mr. Aiyar's point of inviting outside enterprise, in a sense, to come to India to dig and find these things and reveal it to the world. In a sense, you're implying also that art and culture works as an ambassador for its source nation. And so it needs to be revealed. Now, there are various, I think this is a very enlightened view. And if we look at the historic examples you gave, Egypt, China too, where things were really dug up by foreign nations. And it wasn't ever the locals doing it. But it has now, in hindsight, also created issues. What is the ownership, right? Egypt had a contract with the German digger too, and they would split what they would find. So Nefertiti is now in Berlin. But Egypt has gone this far today to say all of this, what is left, Egypt, belongs to Egypt. It's all stolen. Everything around the world is stolen. That's quite extreme view, in view what this has all done. Someone told me also about the Elgin marbles at the British Museum. Without them coming to England, without them being revealed to the West, Greece would maybe still be under Turkish control. It helped them be rehabilitated, so to speak. So I think your view is extremely enlightened. If India doesn't have the means today to do it themselves, let others come to do it. But how do you protect this heritage well then? And what is the best way to split it, so to speak? Or how to take it forward? For India, this is the greatest treasure it's sitting on and hasn't really tapped into until now.
Okay, there are a lot of politics that comes into this. Who owns what? The Kohinoor diamond is one of the big things in India. Does it belong to England? And there are lots of people who say, no, this belongs to India. You know, there was this boy, Dilip Singh, the son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and he was more or less pressured into kind of gifting it. It wasn't really a gift. So India should get it back. And we, of course, keep shouting that. But a small detail that actually all this action took place in Lahore. So Pakistan will say, actually, it belongs to us. Who on earth says this belongs to India? And then beyond that, you take a little look, but how did Ranjit Singh get the Kohinoor diamond in the first place? And the answer is that actually it was with a particular Afghan king. And Ranjit Singh invited that gentleman over for dinner and then made it clear that he would not be allowed to go home until he parted with the Kohinoor diamond. And so you could say, actually, Afghanistan should be having I mean, you can go on with this kind of thing. So there's a lot of politics and stuff that goes on forever. I will merely say that we need to I don't have a firm view on this. I will say that a very large number of monuments, by being taken abroad and being preserved, they were saved. Had they remained where they were in their home states, they might have been destroyed. And we have to take due note of that. Now, from this point onwards, if anything is found in India, in a new archaeological dig, whether it's done by a Danish team or a Swedish team, I mean, surely today it would be regarded as India. But as to what happens about things historically which were uncovered and taken, I have no firm view on that. I have no firm view on whether or not the Kohinoor diamond should be returned to India or Pakistan or Afghanistan. I think that the important thing is that it should be available for viewing to all of humankind. And so if it's possible for all of humankind to go and view the Kohinoor diamonds, wherever it may be, I think humankind has received a good service.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for having joined us. I'd just like to quickly, I'm sorry, I thought we were being, please go ahead. Oh, sorry. No, I just thought I would end with just two quick points. One, that we really have enlarged the comprehension of culture into something that is dynamic and admits of every form of interpretation. So in that context, I want to acknowledge that yesterday, the 13th of September, was the death anniversary of the rapper Tupac Shakur, known as Tupac. And one of his most famous songs, he was shot in 1996, was called Reality is Wrong. And I think that really was what inspired Nicholas Roerich. The reality that he saw was wrong, and he saw the banner of peace as a means of transforming that reality into something that is right. And finally, I want to leave you with one article of the Roerich Pact, which is often neglected or forgotten. The same respect and protection should be given to historic monuments, museums, scientific, artistic, educational, and cultural institutions in times of peace as they are in war. And I think it's salutary for us to remember that, whether it's an institution like the Jaipur Literary Festival, it is incumbent upon us to protect it in times of peace as much as it would be in the hopefully unthinkable context of war. Because as long as minds are not allowed to meet, ideas are not allowed to collide, and hearts are not allowed to embrace, then all that the culture of peace and Nicholas Roerich wanted for war will be denied to us in peace. Thank you for joining us.